7 languages, fluent in 7 different languages at age 30, with a PhD in linguistics and a mind that danced between words like a conductor directing symphonies. Then came the stroke, sudden, devastating, stealing Elena Petrov's greatest gift in the span of minutes. The woman who had once translated for world leaders, who had taught language to refugees, who had made her living with words, suddenly found herself trapped in a prison of silence. But when Elena Petrov walked onto the America's Got Talent stage 18 months later, she wasn't there to mourn what she had lost. She was there to demonstrate what she had found, a completely new form of human communication that transcended every language she had ever known. Simon Cowell thought he was about to hear another inspirational story of someone overcoming adversity. He had no idea he was about to witness the invention of an entirely new language, one made not of words, but of melodies, where thoughts became music and emotions were expressed through harmonies that spoke more clearly than speech ever could. When Elena began to talk through her piano, when she demonstrated that communication doesn't require words, if you can find the right melody, Simon Cowell realized he wasn't just watching a performance. He was witnessing the birth of a new way for human beings to connect. Let me take you back to the moments before Elena Petrov proved that when words fail, music can become the most eloquent language of all. It was Thursday evening at the Dolby Theater in Los Angeles, and America's Got Talent was in the middle of what would become its most linguistically revolutionary season yet. The familiar energy buzzed through the venue, 3,400 audience members filling the red velvet seats, many of them from medical and therapeutic communities who had heard about Elena's unprecedented approach to aphasia recovery through professional networks. Simon Cowell sat at the judges' table in his signature black t-shirt and perfectly tailored blazer, but tonight his expression carried more intrigue than usual. The producers had briefed him about this particular contestant in terms that seemed almost impossible. They'd explained that he might be witnessing someone who had created an entirely new form of communication that could revolutionize how we think about language, music, and human connection. Sofia Vergara was unusually quiet, having been deeply moved during the pre-show briefing about Elena's journey from linguistic genius to aphasia patient to musical innovator. Heidi Klum and Howie Mandel were both fascinated, understanding that they were about to witness something that challenged fundamental assumptions about how human beings communicate. Terry Crews had spent extra time preparing for this introduction, knowing that his words needed to be chosen carefully for someone whose relationship with language had become complicated. The evening had already been remarkable, but everyone involved in the production understood that what was about to happen would be different. This wasn't about discovering talent. This was about witnessing innovation, about seeing whether music could truly replace language, whether melody could carry meaning as powerfully as words. Backstage, Elena Petrov sat in the contestant waiting area, but she wasn't sitting quietly. Her hands moved constantly, not in nervous fidgeting, but in the flowing gestures of someone whose mind was constantly creating melodies to replace the words that would no longer come. At 31, she looked both older and younger than her years. Older because the stroke had aged her in ways that went beyond physical appearance. Younger because her musical communication had given her a childlike wonder at discovering new ways to express herself. Beside her sat Dr. Anton Petrov, her husband of 8 years, and a neurologist who understood better than anyone the magnitude of what Elena had accomplished in her recovery. "Yelena," he said softly, using the Russian version of her name that she had always preferred, "are you sure you're ready for this? The stress of performance, the pressure of communicating with strangers, it could be overwhelming." Elena looked at him and her hands began to move, conducting an invisible orchestra. Then she hummed a melody, soft, reassuring, with undertones of confidence and determination. Anton smiled, understanding immediately what she had said. "Yes, I know you've been practicing. I know you're ready. I just worry that people won't understand what you're trying to do." Elena's response was another melody, this one more complex, with harmonies that seemed to express concepts like teaching, sharing, and hope. To Anton, who had spent 18 months learning to understand his wife's musical language, her meaning was clear. She wasn't performing for herself, she was performing to show other aphasia patients that communication was still possible, just different. The journey to this moment had been swift and devastating, followed by slow and miraculous recovery. Elena had been at the peak of her career, head of translation services for the United Nations, working on peace negotiations and international treaties, her mind constantly switching between languages with the ease of someone for whom words were not just tools, but toys. The stroke had happened on a Tuesday morning while she was preparing for a major diplomatic conference, massive, sudden, targeting the language centers of her brain with surgical precision. She had awakened in the hospital 3 days later to discover that while her intelligence was intact, her ability to access words had been almost completely severed. It was like being a pianist whose hands had been cut off, Anton had explained to colleagues, except the hands were still there, still moving, but disconnected from the music they had once created. Traditional speech therapy had helped slightly. Elena could sometimes access basic words with enormous effort, could understand everything said to her, could read with difficulty. But the fluent, multilingual communicator she had been seemed gone forever. The breakthrough had come 6 months into her recovery, during a particularly frustrating therapy session where Elena had been trying unsuccessfully to ask for water. In her frustration, she had begun humming, not random sounds, but a specific melody that somehow conveyed thirst, need, request. Anton, who was always present during her sessions, had found himself understanding exactly what she meant. It was as if she had discovered that melody could carry meaning just as precisely as words, he had told her speech therapist, not just emotion, but specific, complex concepts. Over the following months, Elena had developed what could only be described as a musical vocabulary, different melodies for different emotions, specific harmonic progressions for requests, complex compositions that told stories or explained ideas. She had essentially created a new language, one that existed in music rather than words. Elena Petrov, called Maria, one of the production assistants, her voice carrying special gentleness since she had been briefed on Elena's unique communication needs. Elena stood up gracefully, smoothing down the navy blue dress that Anton had helped her choose. In her mind, she ran through the musical conversation she had planned for this moment. Not a performance in the traditional sense, but a demonstration of how music could replace language entirely. Remember, Anton said, walking with her toward the stage entrance, if you become frustrated, if the melodies don't come the way you want them to, just take your time. Everyone here wants to understand what you're sharing. Elena turned to him and hummed a brief, sweet melody, her musical way of saying, I love you, before placing her hand over her heart and nodding. She was ready. Terry Crew's voice carried across the theater. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elena Petrov. The curtain rose, and Elena began the walk that would either demonstrate the future of human communication or remain a beautiful but isolated example of one person's unique adaptation to disability. The audience's reaction was initially warm but cautious. Elena moved with obvious grace and intelligence, but there was something in her bearing that suggested complexity, the careful way she observed everything, the slight hesitation that came from knowing that traditional interaction would be difficult. Simon leaned forward, studying Elena with curiosity and respect. There was something about this woman that commanded attention not through obvious charisma, but through a presence that suggested depths waiting to be explored. Good evening, Terry said warmly as Elena reached center stage, where a grand piano had been positioned alongside the traditional microphone stand. Elena looked at Terry and smiled, then opened her mouth as if to speak. What came out was not words, but a gentle, melodic sound, clearly intentional, clearly meant as greeting, but unlike anything anyone in the theater had heard before. Terry, who had been briefed on Elena's condition, smiled warmly. That was beautiful. Can you tell us your name? Elena moved to the piano and played a short, elegant melody. Not a song, but a musical phrase that seemed to embody identity, personality, introduction. She then gestured to herself, making it clear that the melody was her name translated into music. "That's your name in music?" Terry asked, fascinated. Elena nodded enthusiastically and played the melody again, this time with slight variations that seemed to express different aspects of personality: strength, creativity, determination. Simon was completely absorbed by what he was witnessing. This wasn't performance art or symbolic expression. This seemed to be genuine communication happening through musical means. "Can you tell us what happened to you?" Terry continued gently. Elena's expression became more serious, and she moved to the piano bench. What followed was unlike anything anyone in the theater had experienced: a musical story told through melodies that somehow conveyed narrative without words. She began with a complex, flowing melody that seemed to represent abundance, intelligence, capability. Then the music became discordant, harsh, sudden, clearly representing trauma, loss, damage. Finally, the melody resolved into something different from the opening, not the same as before, but beautiful in a new way, adapted, evolved. The audience was transfixed. They couldn't understand the specific details of what Elena was saying, but the emotional arc was unmistakable: success, catastrophe, adaptation, hope. Was that was that your story?" Terry asked, his voice filled with wonder. Elena nodded and played a brief melody that somehow unmistakably meant yes. "And you use music now instead of words?" Another melody, this one more complex, that seemed to express concepts like different, better, universal, deeper. Simon stood up slowly, beginning to understand the magnitude of what he was witnessing. "Elena," he said, stepping closer to the stage, "can you understand everything we're saying to you?" Elena played a melody that was clearly affirmative, then gestured to her ears and brain, then to the piano, indicating that words came in, but music went out. "And you can express any thought, any emotion through music?" Elena's response was longer, more elaborate, a musical phrase that seemed to demonstrate the concept by expressing multiple ideas simultaneously: agreement, excitement, possibility, hope, creativity. "Can you show us?" Simon asked. "Can you have a conversation with us using only music?" Elena's face lit up with joy, and she played a melody that was unmistakably enthusiastic agreement. What followed was unlike anything in television history: a genuine conversation conducted entirely through musical phrases. Terry would ask a question, Elena would respond with melodies that somehow conveyed specific meaning. Simon would make a statement, and Elena would reply with harmonies that expressed agreement, disagreement, or elaboration. "How do you feel right now?" Terry asked. Elena played a soaring, complex melody that combined excitement, nervousness, hope, and determination. "Are you nervous about performing for us?" A brief, honest melody that seemed to say a little, but mostly excited. "What do you want people to understand about your condition?" Elena's response was longer, more sophisticated, a musical composition that seemed to express concepts like different not broken, music universal language, loss becomes gain, adaptation is evolution. The audience was beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing a novelty act or an inspirational story. They were seeing the demonstration of an entirely new form of human communication. Sophia asked, "Can you tell us about your life before your stroke?" Elena's melody became more complex, incorporating themes that suggested multiple languages, international travel, helping others communicate, somehow conveying the essence of her former career as a translator through purely musical means. Heidi wondered, "Do other people understand your musical language?" Elena gestured toward Anton in the wings and played a melody, then played a slightly different version, indicating that some people could learn to understand while others needed interpretation. Howie, always looking for the practical angle, asked, "Could this be taught to other people with aphasia?" Elena's musical response was enthusiastic and complex, expressing concepts like yes, teaching, sharing, hope for others. But it was Simon who asked the question that would lead to the most profound part of Elena's demonstration. Elena, can you show us how music can express something that words sometimes can't? Elena's expression became deeply serious, and she positioned her hands over the piano keys. What she played next was unlike anything she had shared so far. Not a conversational phrase or a narrative melody, but something deeper, more complex, more emotionally sophisticated than language could capture. The music that emerged seemed to express the experience of losing your primary means of communication while discovering that communication itself could evolve, transform, become something richer and more nuanced than it had been before. It was about loss and gain happening simultaneously, about discovering that adaptation could lead not to a lesser version of yourself, but to a different, perhaps even more sophisticated version. The melody wove together grief and gratitude, frustration and wonder, isolation and connection in ways that felt impossible to express through words in any language. It was the musical expression of a human experience, so complex that only music could contain it. When Elena finished, the theater was completely silent. 3,400 people had just experienced something unprecedented, communication that transcended language, meaning that bypassed words entirely and spoke directly to understanding. Simon was the first to break the silence, his voice thick with emotion. Elena, he said, and had to pause to collect himself. What you just did, I don't have words for what you just did. Elena played a brief, gentle melody that seemed to express understanding and comfort. You've shown us that communication is bigger than language, that meaning can exist without words, that the human capacity for connection is more sophisticated than we ever imagined. Elena's musical response conveyed gratitude and agreement. But more than that, Simon continued, you've created something entirely new. You've invented a form of communication that could help people who struggle with traditional language, not just aphasia patients, but people with autism, people with different learning styles, people who think in ways that words can't capture. Elena's melody became more excited, more expansive, expressing concepts like sharing, teaching, growing, helping others. Simon looked at his fellow judges, then back at Elena. Elena Petrov, what you've demonstrated tonight deserves more than just recognition. It deserves to be shared with the world, studied, developed, taught to others who might benefit from musical communication. He walked to his golden buzzer with absolute conviction. You haven't just performed for us tonight. You've shown us the future of human communication, proved that when one door closes, the human spirit finds ways to open entirely new doors. Simon slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling, raining down on Elena, who looked up at it with wonder and played a melody that was unmistakably celebratory, grateful, and filled with hope for what this recognition might make possible. Now, through all the falling gold, Elena turned to the camera that would broadcast this moment to millions of viewers and played a musical phrase that needed no translation. It was clearly meant for other aphasia patients, other people struggling with communication, a melody that said, "You are not alone. Adaptation is possible. Music is waiting for you too." Anton appeared from the wings, tears streaming down his face as he embraced his wife. "I'm proud of you," he whispered, knowing she would understand his words even though her responses would be musical. Elena's reply was a melody that expressed love, gratitude, and the joy of being truly understood. 3 months later, Elena Petrov won America's Got Talent, but more importantly, her musical communication system became the subject of intense study by linguists, neurologists, and music therapists worldwide. Universities began developing programs in musical communication therapy, using Elena's methods to help other aphasia patients develop their own musical vocabularies. The Elena Petrov Institute for Musical Language was established, providing resources for people with communication disorders to explore music as an alternative form of expression. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the emergence of a growing community of musical speakers, people with various communication challenges who had learned to use Elena's methods to express themselves through melody rather than words. Elena became an international advocate for neurodiversity in communication, working with researchers to develop standardized musical vocabulary that could be taught to families of aphasia patients, to medical professionals, to anyone who wanted to learn this new form of human connection. 2 years after her AGT appearance, Elena published, with Anton's help, transcribing her musical ideas into written form, a groundbreaking book called The Melody of Meaning: How Music Became My Language, which became required reading in communication disorder programs worldwide. During her book tour, Elena would demonstrate her musical communication at medical conferences, universities, and therapy centers. At each venue, she would speak with audience members through music, showing how melody could convey not just emotion, but specific, complex ideas. Elena has shown us that human communication is far more flexible and creative than we ever imagined, one linguistics professor wrote. She hasn't just adapted to her aphasia, she's evolved beyond it, creating a form of communication that may actually be more nuanced and emotionally rich than traditional language. The lesson Elena Petrov taught the world that night is profound. When life takes away one gift, the human spirit has the capacity to develop new gifts that may be even more extraordinary than what was lost. Communication doesn't require words if you can find the right melody, and sometimes our greatest limitations become the inspiration for our most innovative breakthroughs. Simon Cowell learned that judging talent sometimes means recognizing when someone hasn't just overcome their challenges, they've transformed them into entirely new forms of human capability that could benefit people far beyond themselves. And Elena proved that language is not the only path to communication, that music can carry meaning as precisely as words, and that sometimes losing one form of expression forces us to discover forms of connection we never knew were possible. The golden confetti from that night has been swept away, but the golden moment it represented, when a woman who lost her words found melodies that spoke more clearly than speech, when disability became different ability, when one person's adaptation became everyone's inspiration, continues to revolutionize how we think about communication, about recovery, about the incredible adaptability of the human spirit. In the end, Elena Petrov didn't just learn to live without words. She proved that human connection transcends language, that music is indeed a universal language, and that sometimes our greatest losses lead to discoveries that make the world more beautiful, more connected, more understanding of the many different ways human beings can share their hearts and minds with each other.